Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this Share Action webinar this afternoon. I'm just going to hold off for another minute because I think a few people are just joining us. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, let's slow down the number of people joining now. So let's get started. My name's Penny Fowler. I'm the head of the corporate climate team at Share Action. And it's a pleasure to have you join us for this afternoon's webinar on the shareholder resolution on Scope 3 emissions that we've co-filed at Yara International. It's great to see this level of interest in the resolution, and we're looking forward to sharing more information about it. The webinar is set to run for 45 minutes. We'll spend about the first 30 minutes with our two speakers presenting, and then we'll allow us a good 15 minutes or so for any questions that you may want to ask either of them. So as you'll have seen when registering for the webinar, we've got two speakers this afternoon. Firstly, Mariet Druif, who's Responsible Investment Officer at Cardano, based in the Netherlands, and one of the co-filers of the shareholder resolution at Yara. She will be speaking about why Cardano has chosen to co-file and will be voting in support of the resolution. Obviously, it's for each individual investor to reach its own voting decisions, although Share Action strongly recommends that investors do vote in support of the resolution, which we believe is going to help to encourage Yara to become a leader in the fertilizer sector on climate. The second speaker this afternoon is Chris Baldock. He's the head of data methodology at Planet Tracker, and he's going to present to you the financial case for investors to consider the impacts of nitrogen fertilizers and planetary boundaries more broadly. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mariet, who's going to speak first. And over to you, Mariet.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you for introducing me. So my name is Mariet from Cardano, and I will give a short overview of why Cardano co-filed a shareholder resolution together with Share Action, Ethos Foundation, Greater Manchester Pension Fund, and PGM. So we decided to escalate with a shareholder resolution because the coalition has been engaging with the company for about 2.5 years now. And we repeatedly asked Yara to publish comprehensive Scope 3 targets. But Yara didn't want to commit to setting targets anytime soon. And it was also not forthcoming in explaining what the challenges were to set targets and what it was doing to mitigate their emissions. So Yara couldn't give us the assurance that it's operating and has plans that are in line with the Paris Agreement. So therefore, we co-filed the shareholder resolution. And what does the shareholder resolution entail? So we request the company to set comprehensive Scope 3 targets, which means more specifically that we request Yara to set science-based targets to reduce Scope 3 emissions over the short, medium, and long term in line with a 1.5 degree scenario and implement measures to reduce such emissions. And the targets and the measures should both include upstream as well as downstream emissions and result in an absolute reduction in emissions. And lastly, Yara should disclose this before the next annual shareholder meeting in 2025. Next slide, please. So why do we focus on Scope 3? As you can see in this picture, the vast majority of Yara's Scope 3 emissions, Yara's emissions come from Scope 3. About 15% comes from its upstream emissions and another 60% from its Scope 3 downstream emissions. So in total, around 75 of its emissions come from Scope 3. Next slide, please. Then Yara does have targets on scope 3, but these are not comprehensive. So firstly, Yara doesn't have a long-term scope 3 target. So unlike other companies, Yara doesn't have, for example, a net zero 2050 target. Next to that, Yara doesn't have an absolute near-term target covering its upstream emissions. And as you saw in the previous slide, this is 15% of its emissions. And then its near-term downstream target, which is to reduce nitrogen use phase emissions by 11.1% by 2030, is unlikely to be in line with a 1.5 pathway for nitrogen use phase emissions, because, for example, the International Fertilizer Association estimates that use phase emissions must be reduced by 70% by 2050 to align with a 1.5 pathway. So 11.1% by 2030 is probably not sufficient.
Sorry, Mariet, can I just pause you for a minute? It looks
Sure.
from the Q&A that people can't actually see the slides. It's not moving through for them. So if you just bear with me 1 second, I might
Sure.
try a different option. Apologies. Can everyone see the slides now?
No, Jackie, we can see your Salesforce page.
Sorry, guys, this is a different platform. Bear with me.
We can see the introductory slide. You want to try clicking it? Still just seeing the introductory slide at the moment, Jackie. Oh. I can see them. Okay, looks like it's working now, people are saying. So
Great.
go ahead, Mariet.
Shall I
Apologies,
continue?
everybody.
Where was I? The downstream target. Yeah, so the International Fertilizer Association estimates that around that nitrogen use emissions should be reduced by 70% in 2015 to align with the 1.5 degree. And then lastly, Yara does have an intensity target covering its upstream emissions from purchased ammonia, but this will expire next year and it will not result in any absolute reduction. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So how has Yara responded to our request to set a comprehensive scope 3 targets? So in the past 2.5 years, Yara said it will produce more comprehensive scope 3 targets by 2027. But the effects of climate change are not long-term and they're happening already. So this needs to be addressed now and not in 2027. Yara mentioned that it's waiting for the publication of the SBTi chemical sector guidance, and this will be published in Q3 of this year. So the company should be able to set their targets before their next annual general meeting. Then Yara mentioned, and other companies also mentioned, that the upstream data collection is an obstacle in setting upstream targets. But last year we have seen that other major chemical companies like BASF are setting targets, and that they are using verified data. So we recognize this is difficult, but it is possible to set those targets. And then, what is especially concerning in its 2023 integrated report, Yara mentioned that it may confirm its downstream KPI from absolute to intensity. So this may mean that there will no absolute reduction in emissions at all. And Yara also mentioned that it may not follow the guidance of external standard setters in setting Scope 3 targets when the guidance is released. And if you could go to the next slide, please, Jackie. So Yara writes in its report that under the current disclosure methodologies, improved use phase efficiency cannot be counted as a climate solution in Yara GHG accounting. If external setters fail to acknowledge scientific facts, we will prioritize scientific evidence over established protocols. In our last investor-backed letter, we asked the CEO of Yara which external setters they were referring to. We have not had a response from Yara, but we are assuming that they are referring to the SBTi because that's the most globally recognized initiative in defining the science-based targets. And although we recognize that the nitrogen use efficiency is important and downstream Scope 3 emissions are hard to reduce for Yara, we are very concerned that this may not result in eventual absolute reduction. So if Yara doesn't have any verified science-based targets, Scope 3 targets, that is not absolute, and not having a long-term target, this raises concerns for us because it doesn't give us any assurance that Yara is operating in line with the Paris Agreement, and that Yara is not making decisions that are bad for the climate. And next to contributing to the negative effects of climate change, it may also create reputational risk for Yara because Yara presents itself as a sustainable leader in the climate transition, and Yara may lose market share because buyers from Yara, such as large food manufacturers like Nestle, do have ambitious Scope 3 targets. So these are the reasons why Cardano believes it's essential for Yara to publish a comprehensive Scope 3 target, and we co-filed the resolution. Thank you, and back to Penny.
Many thanks, Mariet, and apologies everybody for that technical hitch with the slides not moving on. I'm going to hold the questions until the end of both presentations. We can see what you're posting in the Q&A tab. Somebody's already asked if we can see the slide. We can share the slides afterwards, which I think should be fine. But thanks again to Mariet, and I'll hand over straight away to Chris, who's now going to make a slightly broader presentation on the impacts of nitrogen fertilizer. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. Can you confirm that you can see the slide?
Yes, I
Perfect.
can.
Thanks. So I'm going to present the wider context to why we think Scope 3, setting a sensible Scope 3 GHG downstream target is linked to improving the impacts or reducing impacts from fertilizer more broadly.
Sorry, Chris, I've just had a thingy saying that somebody can't see the slides.
Okay.
Just as a message in the Q&A. Is that right? Can other people not see the slides as well?
I think there was a follow-up to say it's working now. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, brilliant. And so we think setting and achieving downstream Scope 3 GHG targets aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway could better place Yara in a world where global demand for fertilizer decreases, nitrogen use efficiency improves in high-income countries, market access improves in low-income countries, and consumer preferences change. And in my presentation, I'm going to cover all 4 of those aspects in relation to a report we produced called Fixing Nitrogen at the end of 2023. So first of all, we'd like to talk about the impacts of nitrogen fertilizer use and planetary boundaries. So I'm just going to give a brief example in relation to the United States, and we're using some data from the UN from their FALSTAT application. And so the United States in this instance represents about 9% of global nitrogen fertilizer application. And so when we look at cropland in the US, there's about 20 million tons of nitrogen fertilizer applied per year. Some of that comes from the atmosphere in terms of rainfall. Some of that comes in seeds that are coated with nitrogen. Some of that comes in the form of manure. And then about 7.5 million tons from biological nitrogen fixation, so the bacteria in the roots of plants. But obviously the majority, just under 50%, is coming from nitrogen fertilizer application. So about 20 million tons in results in about 20 million tons out. So where does that go? About 65% of that goes into the crop. So that's either the part of the crop that you eat, or that's part of the foliage of the crop that either gets destroyed or gets put back into the soil. But then some of that is lost in other ways. So some of that is emitted to air through volatilization. Some of that is leached into ground and surface water and lost through rainfall. And there's some other losses in there as well. And that causes some localized impacts. And so air pollution is one of those impacts. So NOx can come off of the fertilizer that's left on the soil, and that can be converted into ground level ozone, causing some human health impacts. There's the greenhouse gas emission impact. So the nitrogen turns into nitrous oxide and ammonia, adding to greenhouse gas emissions. If you apply too much, you can also acidify soils, which you then have to pay for in terms of liming the soil to rebalance the pH. If you apply too much, you can also damage soil structure, which makes the soil less resilient to extremes in weather. So droughts, that means that if there's a complex soil structure, roots can dig deeper, they can retain more water in the soil, makes crops more resilient. But also conversely, if there's too much rain, the extensive root system can mean that there's more water held. In terms of financial impacts that we tried to calculate for the financial audience in our Fixing Nitrogen report, we used a report from the United Nations Environment Programme, which estimates that globally we waste about $200 million a year on fertilizer that's lost to the environment. And a common impact of nitrogen in waterways is that it causes algal blooms. And so an estimate from the Environmental Working Group estimates that the US has spent over $1 billion since 2010 dealing with the effects of algal blooms. Planet Tracker's analysis, one of our reports, we looked at about 10 aquaculture companies and looked at salmon losses due to algal blooms. And so that affects mortality, but also affects growth rates. And they lost nearly $400 million US over a course of 5 years. And that ended in 2018, that study. So there are some severe financial impacts, and from what we've shown, just to a small group of companies here. So they were localized impacts. In terms of globalized impacts, you're all familiar with climate change, and that's the planetary boundary. Nitrogen is another planetary boundary that we've looked at. And if you look at the bottom of the diagram, you can see biogeochemical flows. That's where the nitrogen planetary boundary is located, and we're exceeding our planetary boundary for that. You can also see on the left-hand side, there's the land system change planetary boundary. That's deforestation, essentially. And both of those planetary boundaries will be touched on in our Fixing Nitrogen report, and both are related to fertilizer use, and I'll show you shortly. And so I just want to take you through how we can look at or conceptualize the nitrogen planetary boundary in a way that you might be familiar with in terms of the climate change planetary boundary. So we have an economic activity, which is agricultural production, which obviously uses fertilizer in a lot of instances. Now, we can measure the impact of the pollutants coming off of agriculture from fertilizer use in a number of ways. We can look at nitrogen in surface water. We can measure other things like nitrates, N2O, and ammonia emissions going to air. What we did in our study, we looked at nitrogen in surface water, which causes those algal blooms. And what you can look at the nitrogen as a pollutant in the stock of the environment, or so you can look at its concentration in the water, or you can look at the annual flow of nitrogen going into water. And once you've worked out those in relation to what it should be, you can start to look at the environmental and financial impacts from exceeding planetary boundaries. And so to make that relevant for a financial audience, we try to look at the budget side of this little flow chart. And for the nitrogen concentration, we would have to go to a very local level to find the nitrogen concentration in waterways. Typically, that's less than 2.5 milligrams of nitrogen per litre. It's very difficult to relate back to the financial world. And so we thought we could look at the annual flow of emissions from farmland into waterways. Again, you can do that, but it's very data intensive. You have to go to a very local level. And again, it's very difficult to go back up to a publicly traded company to estimate their contribution to that impact. So instead of looking at that part of the equation, we looked at this economic activity end. So our planetary boundary for nitrogen usage is 82 to 60 million tons of nitrogen fertilizer application per year. Currently, we're around 160 million tons. So we're way over our planetary boundary. That enables, and looking at that end of the equation, it allows us to link that nitrogen planetary boundary to nitrogen producers and nitrogen users. So either the food manufacturers or the food producers if they're publicly traded. And what we've tried to do for our financial audience is in our Fixing Nitrogen report to look at 7 different case studies, 7 different ways in which that might be applicable for you. So we looked at nitrogen limits in a bit more detail, looking at tipping points and planetary boundaries. We looked at the connectivity between land and ocean, so the nitrogen being applied in land and the impact that has in the aquatic ecosystem. 3 and 4 case studies, we looked at closing yield gaps and how that could free up land for other activities. So in this one, we looked at reforestation, so we could get back to within our land system change planetary boundary. We looked at tech bets, so looking at man-made technologies versus nature-based solutions and how you could use them in conjunction with each other to improve nitrogen use efficiency. And then we looked at the fossil fuel dependence of fertilizers, which I'm sure you're all very aware of. Then we looked at the agricultural dependent trade of some big agricultural countries. So Brazil and Argentina were 2 standouts in the study. They have a high dependence on imported fertilizer, and also their GDP and export revenue is highly dependent on agriculture. And then finally, we looked at nitrogen budget trading and litigation around nitrogen pollution. Now, what efforts are occurring in terms to try and improve nitrogen use efficiency, and where is fertilizer used or underused? So as part of our analysis, we tried to look at the countries and the crops that are contributing to exceeding the planetary boundary. You can see North America, South America, Europe, and large parts of Asia are contributing to exceeding our planetary boundary, so going over the 82 million tons of nitrogen per year. The areas in green are the ones below that lower limit, the 60 million tons of nitrogen per year. So they could be using more, up to that 60 million mark. And then the ones in beige are the ones in that danger zone in between 60 and 80 million tons. So really, you're either applying too much nitrogen fertilizer and losing too much, or you're not applying enough. So that relates to that market access point that I talked about at the start. So in Africa, there's an opportunity to use more nitrogen fertilizer in crop production, but the issue is getting it to smallholder farmers. So it's not so much of a challenge for large public companies at the moment. In terms of nitrogen use efficiency, there is a limit to fertilizer's impact on crop yields. You can't just put lots of nitrogen on and expect more crop yields. In this instance, for these crops, anything more than 150 to 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare is essentially wasted. So that's linked back to the $200 million of wasted expenditure on fertilizer that we mentioned at the start of the UNEP study. There are some issues with fertilizer application, which can cause it to be lost, which are that it's applied at the wrong time, in the wrong place, it's in the wrong quantity, or it's the wrong type. But even though we're using too much fertilizer, still many crops are produced below their attainable yields. And so here we've looked at something called the Yield Gap Atlas, and we're looking particularly here at soybean production in Brazil, which is 44% below its attainable yield. And soybean is a really important product for Brazil because a lot of it goes to China, which represents about 30% of Brazil's agricultural exports, which goes into China's pork industry. Brazil imports a lot of fertilizer, about $13 billion worth, but it also has a national policy for reducing its dependence on imported fertilizer from 85% today to 45% in 2050. And so some added context around that there are large swathes which all impact nitrogen fertilizer usage. And there are large swathes of rainforest which are cleared for farming cattle, soy and maize, which release greenhouse gases. But it also has a local climate impact. So changing rainfall patterns, which changes the seasons, the start of the rainy season in Brazil, which can make it harder to produce food. But then that also impacts when you can apply fertilizer and in what quantity. So if you've got a smaller window to apply fertilizer, you maybe apply too much, you lose too much. And then again, it's a waste for farmers. We looked at that in our report called No Rain on the Plain. And it's also linked to countries having targets to reduce their fertilizer use independence. It's not just Brazil, it's other countries as well. Companies obviously have targets not to produce greenhouse gas intensive products and not to purchase products from areas associated with deforestation. So the EU's imported deforestation regulation. All of these factors are interlinked, which affect fertilizer usage. It's not just fertilizer usage, but looking at all of these things that are interlinked, we think that the greenhouse gas emissions target for Scope 3 starts to allow you to address all of these other interlinked factors. Some of the other factors we could mention, farming factors. So the lack of cover crops and monocultures, which make it a lot easier for nitrogen to be lost from the field. There's some efforts to change farming practices to combat that. There's some climate factors, which we've mentioned in terms of shifting growing seasons and increasing extremes in weather. Fertilizer use is impacted by all of those things. But looking forward to 2050, what are we focused on as a society in terms of reducing our nitrogen fertilizer use? So if we look at fertilizer supply and demand, as we mentioned at the start, our current application of nitrogen fertilizer is about 160 million tons per year. And then our upper end of the planetary boundary is 82 million tons, the lower end is 60. And so some academic studies have been published which say if we improve our nitrogen use efficiency by deploying precision agriculture and better applying our nitrogen fertilizer, that could come down to 60 million tons by 2050. If that happens in conjunction with a dietary shift, so we consume more crops instead of consuming livestock products, so instead of crops going to producing livestock, it goes straight to human consumption, that demand could go down to 35 million tons. And just for context, in Yara's 2022 integrated report, they produced 20.5 million tons of fertilizer in 2022. They have a target to increase that by about 10% by 2025. Obviously, there are lots of other companies, Nutrient, CF Industries, etc., that are in this market. So that really leaves us with the question for this audience: are we at peak nitrogen fertilizer production? And are any of these assets currently planned or currently in operation at risk of stranding? And so we think that having a downstream Scope 3 GHG target aligned to a 1.5 degree scenario could better place companies in a world where fertilizer is used more sustainably. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. That was very helpful context and an overview of the broader situation relating to the use and climate impacts of nitrogen fertilizers, which was really, really helpful. We've got time for some questions for either of our panelists to answer. I think you need to type any questions that you may have into the Q&A tab. I haven't seen any come up so far. So now is your chance if you'd like to ask either Mariet or Chris a question. Lydia, do you want to come over?
Hi both, and thanks for two wonderful presentations. I have a quick question for Chris, which is that, or to ask you, so what can companies like Yara do to either support the adoption of nitrogen use efficiency practices in their downstream supply chains, or to diversify their product portfolios away from nitrogen fertilizers? Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. I think looking at planetary boundaries is a very important step for all fertilizer companies, because that sets the context for fertilizer use going forward. So if we're at least double our planetary boundary, that that says that we either are going to be causing some significant environmental damage and causing some significant environmental change over the next 10, 20, 30 years to 2050. And in terms of planning assets, in terms of producing more fertilizer or producing better fertilizer, that needs to be taken into context. So yeah, I would no specific recommendations for Yara, but I think having the planetary boundaries at the center of your thinking, because it's not just nitrogen, it is greenhouse gas emissions, which obviously this resolution focuses on, but that's where I would say.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Anybody else have any questions? I can't see any coming up in the Q&A box. If you don't have any questions, we can give you back some more of your time this afternoon. I'll just give you the last chance to type any questions into the chat. And to repeat, we should be able to share the slides with participants after the webinar today. And if you think of questions after this afternoon's webinar, do please feel free to get in touch, and we can try and follow up and respond to anything that you might want to ask in retrospect. I've just seen, I can see something's coming in from Mariet, but I can't see the full question or who's asking it. Would that person like to finish writing the question for Mariet? No more coming. No more information coming through. Okay. Well, in that case, I think we will wrap this up. If there's no further questions from anybody today, just leaves it to me to thank very much our two speakers this afternoon. Both really informative and useful presentations. I hope you found them to be so, and thank you all again for joining. Bye-bye.